back. This is session 2 of the Freedom in Conservative Thought symposium. Our first speakers for this session are Elizabeth Thomas and Ravi Chakraborty. Elizabeth Thomas is Assistant Professor of Cultural Studies at the Alliance University of Liberal Arts in Bangalore. Her doctoral thesis at the University of Humanistic Studies in Utrecht examines the evolution of social justice discourse and its influence on contemporary political and social debates in India. Currently, her research focuses on long-held interests, developing a conceptual basis for conservatism, understanding the challenges of upholding pluralism and unraveling the relationship between law and society, all within the Indian context. Ravi Chakraborty is Assistant Professor of Philosophy, also at the University, the Alliance School of Liberal Arts in Bangalore. His doctoral research was on the philosophical implications of using mathematical ideas to study literary form, the manner in which relativism manifests as a concern in the philosophy of mathematics led him to explore relativism in other domains like science, law, and political philosophy, hence arriving at a current interest in understanding variations of conservatism, if any. Today, their paper is titled Freely Evolving with the Nation Outside the Law, an Alternative Genealogy of Freedom. Ravi and Elizabeth.
You need to unmute.
Ravi, you'll need to turn your mic on.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, please,
Yes.
please continue.
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to thank everybody. Thanks, Aaron, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for especially Professor John and everybody else who is organizing this conference for choosing this paper and giving us an opportunity to present. So the way we'll go about it is that I will read the beginning section of the paper, after which Elizabeth will take over from me. And I have some supporting slides for you, so that you can keep track of the points. But mostly I will be reading from my paper, so you can't rely on the slides too much, but just in case it helps you to keep track of what I'm saying. So, I want to begin with just two quick observations, given what has just uh, been spoken about. Firstly, when Professor John was speaking, there was this distinction that came out, which is philosophy itself being conservative in terms of, not having an aspiration to change things. And the other, which means that philosophy is conservative in, not going out and seeking to change the world. And the other idea is a conservative political philosophy in itself, right? So for me, it's clearly uh, not the former, which means when I'm talking about philosophy, I am not talking about philosophy being conservative, because incidentally, when we chose the Indian philosophers we wanted to focus on, they actually are all great politicians and political thinkers who had an actual influence on Indian history, right? So they were not really academics in that sense. And I think it says something about the Indian intellectual tradition as far as conservatism is concerned, that our default choice were actually, in a sense, directly were politicians of a certain kind, right? So that is the first observation that I want to make. That in that sense, we are talking about conservative thinkers who were not at all conservative about the ability of their philosophy to change the world. The second point that I want to make is, when Lawrence was speaking about building a ground for, if you like, a presumptive ground or an axiomatic fundamental position for for philosophy and for conservative philosophy, especially, I think that task, given our paper, there could be a gap as far as our paper is concerned, because the way we construct a genealogy of freedom, we kind of intervene at a specific point in the history of India, and we don't really go back to the an absolute metaphysical ground of freedom and understand and sort of build our notions of conservatism and freedom on top of it. That's not something we do in this paper, but we thank the opening speakers for sort of highlighting the importance of that project. So I will get on with our paper now. So, uh, you know, s- uh, many scholars and commentators have noted that India appears to lack a clearly defined conservative political tradition. Until the 1980s, this absence was evident even in the realm of active politics, where a recognizable conservative party was largely missing. The rise of the current political dispensation, led by the right wing Bharatiya Janata Party, may seem to have altered that landscape. Yet, public intellectuals continue to ask who are the true conservative ideologues in India. And again, we could make a distinction between ideologues and philosophers, and that could be useful for a discussion. What are the foundational tenets of Indian conservatism, and how might they be meaningfully described? Now, some argue that the very idea of freedom, particularly in its modern political form, is a distinctly Western concept. From the Enlightenment tradition onward, from Kant to John Stuart Mill, freedom has been conceived as intrinsic to human nature. To be human is to be free, and every impediment to free thought and autonomous choice must be overcome. I mean, that probably encapsulates the essence, roughly, very in a very caricatured sense, perhaps, of much of liberal philosophy. Now, Western thinkers from Plato to Kant have framed freedom as a condition necessary for truth seeking and rational autonomy. Now, if you think of Plato's allegory of the cave, and how it depicts freedom as the ascent towards knowledge. If you think about how Kant defines freedom as the individual's emergence from self-imposed tutelage in what is enlightenment. When you think of these intellectual interventions, you see that freedom is a condition necessary for truth seeking and autonomy. Political movements such as the French Revolution sought to translate these philosophical insights into political reality, framing liberty as a foundational civic virtue. Today, both liberal and conservative traditions, in the West at least, are compelled to reckon with these foundations' ideas of liberty and to articulate how each interprets and responds to them. Now, this dialogue has a potential to yield a more textured and philosophically grounded debate on the meaning of freedom. But I believe not just for the sake of looking at the history of the Indian concept of conservatism, but also to test the true generality of conservative conceptions of freedom, if any. We can test the true generality when they are tested in non-Western post-colonial contexts. Now, a small note about genealogy, right? Now, here we are trying to build an alternative genealogy of freedom. Now, a new genealogy of ideas aids the quest to bring the concept of conservatism to bear upon exactly those domains that apparently resist its universalization. Such genealogies can appear like arbitrary webs connecting thinkers separated by time and space. But conservatism is a species of an idea, I argue, that is more enabling for what appears a renegade construction of its own history. And why is that so? Because unlike other political ideas that are transformed completely by the disruptions of history, conservatism by design is meant to resist the overpowering force of history. Now, what do I mean by that? As an example, it may be harder to think of, let's say, a pre colonial liberalism and a contemporary liberalism without noting a break or a contradiction between the two. Similarly, we can think of all the post variations of Marxism, feminism, among others. The liberal tradition appropriates history as a vehicle for progress and is more bound by the power of the historical context to influence ideas. Conservatism, by definition, if not insensitive to history, thrives despite it. Much like it is consistent to draw a line from, say, Burke to Oakeshott, we can also draw a line from a colonial era Gandhi to a post colonial thinker, a Gandhian thinker like Dharampal, who I will explore. Now, to make things concrete, through an example, the Indian conservative may argue that sensitivity to the oppressive dimensions of caste was already a growing consciousness internal to the community's reflective process and not induced by the ideals of equality that the establishment of the colonial state brought about in its wake. This much for justifying genealogies spread over time. The reason why genealogies must bridge over geographical context is more obvious. Most Indian thinkers like Gandhi were exposed to Western conservatism either through their personal intellectual journeys or by virtue of the all pervasive influence of the colonial encounter. In other words, it seems like conservatism would resist the idea of a post, you can fill the blank by whatever you like, post digital, post colonial conservatism. In the Indian intellectual tradition, in general, the concept of freedom has historically been shaped by, by political concerns than by spiritual and metaphysical frameworks. This divergence from Western paradigms may explain why freedom as a clearly political idea has not always occupied a central place in Indian conservative thought. Ancient Indian thinkers like Shankara viewed true freedom as the realization of the self, uh, which is known as Atman, as non different from Brahman, the ultimate and unchanging reality. This freedom was neither political nor social, but ontological, a detachment from Maya or illusion, from which included worldly desires, identities, and actions. Now, I want to clarify that we are not pursuing this rabbit hole of looking at the ground of freedom much further in our paper, but this is going to be useful nonetheless for how we frame our argument. Now, going forward, this inward transcendental conception of freedom, grounded in detachment from desire and ego rather than political autonomy, did not vanish with the onset of Western colonial rule. Instead, it was consciously reactivated and transformed by thinkers like Gandhi and Aurobindo, who may be described as conservatives of a distinctly Indian kind, right? So, uh, so, to both lay political observers and scholars of politics in India, there are roughly two strands of conservatism. Two strands. One can be thought of as conservatism that uses civilizational ancient values. The other, while also referring to these ideas, remolds them for an exclusively religio-nationalistic imagination that has particular resonance for the contemporary times, especially the current right-wing political dispensation in India. Now, this latter project is rightly thought of as exclusionary by the liberal consensus and also perhaps understudied. The former is exemplified by ancient thinkers, beginning from Shankara to modern ones like Gandhi, Aurobindo, Tagore, and Dharampal, among others. But for the exception of Gandhi and Tagore, the progressivist contempt for any conservative tradition also tends to cast aside the likes of Aurobindo and Dharampal, pushing them to the margins of mainstream academic thought. The innovative system of concepts Gandhi brought about to anchor the Indian independence movement meant that his thought was evidently the center of scholarly attention. But even Gandhi's conservative dimension has not been adequately studied. While Gandhi is often castigated by Ambedkarite radicals for what they deem to be his conservative endorsement of the caste order, there is little substantive discussion of what truly makes Gandhi a conservative. Given this overall neglect of conservative thinkers, the rhetorical question is often asked, where are the Indian conservatives? However, what we want to underline is that their thought was not conservative in the Western sense either. And we can think of thinkers like Burke to Oxford, from Burke to Oxford. and which valorizes institutional continuity, historical inheritance, and a cautious skepticism of rationalist reform. Rather, their conservatism drew from India's spiritual intellectual traditions, where the past is not merely a source of custom or order, but a repository of ethical truths and metaphysical insight. Now, this distinction leads to a divergence between Indian and Western approaches to freedom. One of the commonalities, before we get into the divergence, is obviously a deep skepticism of freedoms granted and managed by the state, and thus also state led projects of emancipation from unfreedoms. In fact, freedom would be defined in opposition to what the state can provide the citizen. Now, 20th century British conservative thinker Michael Oakeshott, for instance, uh, defines freedom as the absence from our society of overwhelming concentrations of power. In Oakshott's view, the modern state's tendency to possess such an overwhelming concentration of power is curtailed by the two forms of freedom that need to be valued above such categories as freedoms of speech, which include the freedom of association and freedom to private property. This conception of freedom becomes clearer in On Human Conduct, where Oakeshott outlines his conception of civil association, a political arrangement in which the state does not pursue ends, but merely frames the space of individual action. But Oakeshott's skepticism of any totalizing force like the state meant he would be suspicious also of any encompassing metaphysical framework. He would be suspicious of any overarching civilizational claim, as also he would be wary of the kind of imposition that nationalism tends to become. Now, here is the difference between thinkers, between Oakeshott's conception of freedom and, let's say, the kind of freedom that people like Gandhi conceive of. Now, thinkers like Gandhi are also skeptical of the abstraction that is the state. They are sort of worry of the importance of a codified legal system. In fact, they are heavily critical of the parliament, which is already in place by that time. They are not, but they have not given up on some kinds of grand narratives. Now, the grand narrative could be the civilizational grand narrative. It could be the narrative of the nation reimagined in terms of decentralized, self sufficient, and sustainable village economies. Now, the civilizational goal, the nation making project, was not a spanner in the works for this Indian conservatism to take root. And this is how we see a divergence from certain strands of Western conservatism. It is this decentralization with a center and autonomy of the parts without losing sight of the whole that gets animated into the metaphor of the beautiful tree, which was first used by Gandhi and then expanded upon fruitfully in the thought of Dharampal, a later uh, Gandhian conservative scholar. The tree is an image of emergent coherence, not forced imposition. It embodies the freedom that is the essence of organic behavior. It is the freedom to branch in new directions to ultimately nourish every leaf and every flower in all the individual glory. And I'm just extending this metaphor because we are thinking of the nation like a tree where whereas the leaves and flowers are like the communities which form the nation, right? Such a vision of the local community was not at odds with the totality in which it was embedded, and that is why it will not be conceptually imprecise to call them instances of a truly Indian conservatism, because the Indian nation was implicit in how they were being imagined. In fact, this view of Indian conservatism is compelling because it arose along with revolutionary calls impatient to overthrow the yoke of colonialism, the erstwhile colonialism. In attempt to marry these two different kinds of projects, Gandhi gave a unique twist to the Sanskrit term of Swaraj, translated at the face of it as self-rule or political freedom. However, for Gandhi, Swaraj was not merely political independence from British colonial rule. It was above all self-mastery, freedom from material desires, from anger and violence that manifests in the political realm towards one's opponents and enslavement to modernity. Now, of course, Like Oakeshott, Gandhi was suspicious of modernity's faith in reason, technology, and rights-based individualism. And he was also suspicious of abstractions like the state. But Gandhi's critique of modernity was not grounded in a preference for tradition as evolved custom, which you probably see in Oakeshott. Instead, he saw tradition as an ethical force anchored in practices of renunciation, restraint, and self-purification. Right? Uh, so, such creative reworking of Indian traditional thought and text can be seen in other thinkers with conservative leanings, such as Aurobindo and Tagore. Aurobindo's civilizational conservatism could be seen as different from both liberal and Western conservative models. He extended Vedantic metaphysics into his theory of freedom. While he acknowledged the political need for national independence, he subordinated it to a cosmic vision of spiritual evolution. He rejected Enlightenment liberalism not in favor of inherited political order, but for a vision of spiritual evolution in which the nation state was merely a stage in the unfolding of cosmic consciousness. In these thinkers, the metaphysical grammar of liberation as self-transcendence persists. Their thought appropriates the idioms of classical philosophy to critique modernity, resist liberal individualism, and anchor freedom in a moral spiritual order rather than in radical self-assertion or democratic equality. Unlike Western conservatives who defend tradition to protect society from radical disruption, these traditions invoke tradition to transform the self, using it as a moral and metaphysical resource to counteract the alienation of modernity. The nation state was not the final custodian of liberty, but a transitory vessel in a longer journey of ethical self discipline and spiritual fulfillment. Uh, Elizabeth will take over from here. Uh, I'll just pass.
Am I on? Am I on? Can you all hear me?
Perfectly, yes.
Yes. Right. So I'd also begin with a small caveat, which is just are looking at a range of agents of just a second. I'm sorry, was I on mute?
No, we heard you, but there's a slight delay. I think if Ravi turns his mic off and then you put yours on,
Yes.
it's
Going from
almost double.
Turn off your mic.
No, sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So I was saying that when we talk about the conservative, on the one hand, as Ravi said in the beginning, it is hard for us to even pick specific thinkers because Gandhi, for instance, would sometimes be analyzed as not a conservative or a conservative of different hue from other, let's say, right-wing conservative thinkers. Secondly, we are looking at all politicians, traditionalists, ordinary actors when we are trying to theorize conservative practices, for instance. So let me take off from where Ravi stopped. Once we can conceive of the possibility of self-transcendence without breaking away from tradition, of which the community is the prime carrier, we must delineate the contours of this decentralized society with free and interconnected communities evolving organically. So the idea of the community or the idea of the development of the autonomy of the community was central to all of these thinkers ranging from Dharampal to Tagore to Gandhi to everyone else. This leads to a distinctive conception of community freedom, not merely as the right to be left alone, but as the right to shape collective life without excessive state interference. This becomes especially apparent in contemporary conservative responses to legal reforms through public interest litigations, such as the opposition to same-sex marriages or challenging the various temple-related rituals that exist to try to modify them, make them quote-unquote more discriminatory, equal, and so on. While these positions are often critiqued as anti-progressive or hostile to individual interests, they reflect a deeper anxiety that the state is increasingly bypassing the moral autonomy of religious and cultural communities. Conservative thought here does not reject change. Rather, it seeks gradual, internally driven adaptations. Traditions are not fixed dogmas, but living frameworks, and their authority arises from their ability to evolve while retaining continuity. In this sense, Indian conservatives, perhaps like their Western counterparts, do not simply privilege community over the individual, but assert that freedom itself, understood as moral self-direction, is impossible without a stable community-based cultural matrix. Now, this, if you wanted to sort of make communities dynamic in the face of 2 centuries of colonialism, you really needed to rethink how you're going to reinvigorate traditions itself, which, according to Gandhi and others, were dying off. So Gandhi was deeply concerned about how his, or rather the Indian conceptions of Swaraj, translated as freedom or self-rule, would be realized in the wake of colonial modernity, which left behind communities and rural environments impoverished in moral, ethical, and economic terms. How was a non-violent, restrained, and self-sufficient individual who could truly act on behalf of a community to be shaped? In response to these concerns, he envisions his ideas about self-rule or Swaraj or freedom as deeply intertwined with the goals of reconstruction of village communities and various other kind of intermediate groups. The aim of such reconstruction was self-reliance of these village communities, which would in their natural course be able to shape ethical individuals who could imagine alternate forms of nation building. While Gandhi might not have made great strides here, his ideas about freedom of Swaraj continue to inform other conservative scholars and thinkers in their effort to rethink a more rooted society where local continuation of community-oriented traditions, civic associations, and local self-governance dominated. Here, it can be emphasized that for conservatives, at least for the Indian conservatives, the freedom of the community to conserve or preserve its inherited customs takes precedence. While it takes precedence, it is articulated less in terms of rights than as part of a pluralistic ethos that enables the flourishing of these groups between the individual and the nation state. These groups could balance the interconnected goals of stability and progress without relying on the deracinated elites who often comprise the so-called civil society. As we were saying earlier, Gandhi's thoughts were sort of, even after Gandhi's life, were taken over by many of his followers or the scholars who could now be called Gandhian scholars, Dharampal being one of them. So Dharampal went about in the early 1960s and 70s, he went about studying, going to various villages of India in the north and south and so on, and studying what was left of these, what he thought were, what he and Gandhi and many conservatives thought of as dynamic communities. And he found among very much both these ethnographic explorations as well as his other archival studies that there were many kind of autonomous systems of schooling, jurisprudence, and civic order, where moral education was integrated with craft, ritual, and oral submissions or transmissions. These systems enable the development of moral agency and practical reason without recourse to state-enforced law. In other words, they produce individuals who were free in the classical sense, capable of ethical judgment and socially grounded action. So he speaks of traditional order which function through plurality of languages, customs, adjudicating bodies, and moral idioms. Panchayats, caste councils, religious trusts, and localized forms of arbitration allowed communities to resolve conflicts with an eye to context, relational nuance, and customary wisdom. So to just give a clarification, by the time Dharampal is doing this exercise, the actual Indian communities, villages have already, according to him, in a way lost its vigor and dynamic nature. So he goes back and finds that they are thriving until 18th century, until the onset of the high modernity of colonialism, high modernity and colonialism. And from that time, it starts, according to him, to wither away. The beautiful tree, as it were, starts dying. European imperialism, colonial rule seem to have fundamentally disrupted the capacity of individuals to basically enact ethical judgments and socially grounded action, and continually shape community from both sides of elite and the general public. These disruptions were mostly felt during attempts by the British administration to streamline and codify community customs and laws. In the late 19th and early 20th century India, there was notable resistance among Indian elites, particularly those with a conservative orientation, against the colonial state's efforts to codify religious customs, especially around temple-related practices and such like. They feared that this codification would freeze the dynamic and locally rooted customs into rigid, state-defined norms, stripping communities of the autonomy to evolve their practices organically. One key arena of resistance was the administration of temples. When the British began taking over temple management under the Madras Hindu Religious Endowment Act of 1926, ostensibly for reasons of efficiency and order, I think that's 1826, many Hindu elites opposed this move, seeing it as both a spiritual intrusion and a disruption of long-standing community rights. What's interesting is that in the much litigation that followed this taking over of the temple administration, the historians and so on observe that the natives start adopting and adapting to the language of rights, which Dharampal and others notice was not there earlier. So they both start using the judicial terms and concepts, as well as the language of rights, freedom, equality, and so on, in ways that was not familiar or practiced earlier. One of the attempts of conservators like Gandhi is to in some ways even make people go back to concepts that they have forgotten, concepts that they now he think are mindlessly using, and concepts that he thinks leads to conflicts. Like, for instance, the use of rights, the rights-bearing language becomes a source of huge conflicts among various Indian communities, especially the religious communities. This wariness towards legal or bureaucratic standardization continues in contemporary Indian conservative strains. Right-leaning voices and traditionalists have strongly resisted judicial or governmental attempts to intervene in long-standing temple-related and other religious customs, arguing that such changes disregard the sacred logic and community consensus that sustain these practices. The administration of Hindu temples by state boards, even today, is another point of contention, with the Free the Temples movement demanding that temple control be returned to practicing Hindu communities. In the argument that the many activities that they undertook before the 19th century has died down and can possibly be revived. This sensibility was also visible in early constitutional debates in the forming of the Constitution, the Constituent Assembly debates, where several conservative politicians and members of the Constituent Assembly expressed deep reservations about the imposition of a uniform civil code. So India still doesn't have a uniform civil code. It has a uniform criminal code, but multiple communities are still ruled by their own civil rules of marriage, succession, and many other aspects of private and personal life. Although the present government is trying to introduce it again. And now the tables have turned. Those who want it are the right, and those who oppose it are the progressivists. Fearing it would erode the plural legal traditions that allow different communities to order their lives according to customs. A lot of this preoccupation with community choice or autonomy to flourish is reflected also in 17th, 18th century generation of conservative Western conservative thinkers. In rejecting the overreach of codified law, Indian thinkers echo German jurist Friedrich Carl von Savigny, who argued that law should emerge from the Volksgeist, the spirit of the people, rather than from legislative fiat. Savigny wrote of the vocation of our age for legislation and jurisprudence in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, amidst debate in Germany about national identity, legal codification, and modernization. Following the disruptions caused by Napoleon's imposition of the French Civil Code across occupied Europe, many in the German territories, especially Prussia, were calling for a similar codification of laws to unify and rationalize the legal system. This moment of legal nationalism was, however, met by Savigny with caution and critique. As a jurist rooted in the emerging historical school of law, Savigny feared that sudden abstract codification divorced from the lived traditions and practices of a people would do more harm than good. He argues that law is not made but is found, a foundational statement for his opposition to top-down legislation. He believes that the true vocation of the age was not to legislate new systems, but to understand and refine the existing legal traditions embedded in the historic life of the people. A generation earlier, Edmund Burke had expressed a similar sensibility in his critique of the French Revolution. In Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, Burke famously described society as a contract between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Like Savigny, Burke feared that radical transformations, unmoved from history and tradition, would destroy the moral fabric of society. He viewed freedom not as an abstract right, but as something deeply embedded in inherited institutions and social habits. Like Burke and Savigny, Oakeshott too, for instance, thinks about law as not commands that tell us what to do, but conditions that shape how we act. Much like saying to someone, drive carefully, rather than saying, okay, drive on the left and reach the store. So in his conception of a civil association, freedom does not lie in being directed towards a common good, but in being able to pursue one's own ends within a shared understanding of how to act justly and responsibly. Now, crucially, freedom as understood in conservatism in general is not defined as unbounded individual autonomy, but as the capacity to act within a web of obligations, customs, and inherited wisdoms that give the self a moral direction. This framing stands in contrast both to modern liberalism's emphasis on abstract individual rights and the modern state's tendency to centralize and codify moral life through law. Conservative thought challenges us to rethink the binary between tradition and freedom. Rather than seeing tradition as a constraint, conservatives reveal how tradition is a very condition for meaningful freedom, not as a legal status, but as an ethical practice embedded in community life. So this conception invites a rich comparative dialogue in our case between Western conservative thinkers like Burke or Oakeshott or Savigny or many others who also resisted rationalized codification, codified and abstract notions of political order. However, one can say that Indian thinkers like Gandhi and Dharampal, among others, offer a civilizationally distinct idea that freedom is realized through the ethical reinterpretation of tradition, especially in response to historical disruptions like Islamic conquest and British colonial rule. What distinguishes Indian conservative thinkers is their decolonial urgency.
Sorry, Elizabeth.
Yes.
I'm so sorry. We're running out of time. Could you?
Yes. I'm winding up. Yes. Is there decolonial urgency? So where Burke or Oakeshott seek to conserve existing institutions, Indian conservatives like Dharampal and Gandhi aim to recover buried moral ecologies that were disrupted by colonial rule. So ultimately, Indian conservatism proposes two interlinked forms of freedom: the freedom of communities to evolve according to their internal logics and mediating with the emergent formation of the notion without being forcibly reshaped by abstract state ideologies or universalizing moral codes, and freedom to cultivate and recover cultural roots. These aspects animate both their conservative philosophy and also their notions of freedom, which is so widespread that one still has to bring it together as a set of concepts or ideas or thoughts. Thank you, and really sorry for taking that extra time.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Ravi and Elizabeth. We've got a couple of minutes for questions.